Sometimes the truth arrives too late to change the past, but just in time to shatter the future. England, 1823. The cottage on the edge of Somerset Village sat nestled among bare February trees, their branches stark against a sky heavy with the promise of rain. Inside the modest dwelling, Rose Hartley bent over her sewing table, her needle moving through the pale fabric with the steady rhythm born of 28 years spent in this same small room. The morning light, thin and grey, filtered through the single window, illuminating the fine auburn strands that had escaped from her braid and the faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose. Another wedding dress, Margaret Davy observed from her place by the fire, her weathered hands busy with darning. That makes 3 this winter already. Rose glanced up, offering the older woman a slight smile. The Thornton girl is to marry the blacksmith's son come spring. Her mother insists on Brussels lace, though I've told her twice it will cost more than she can afford. They always want what's beyond their reach, Thomas Davy muttered from his chair near the hearth, his voice rough with age and the chronic cough that had plagued him through the winter. At 60, his face bore the deep lines of a life spent working the land, though he had long since given up farming in favour of tending the small vegetable garden behind the cottage. Mark my words, girl, she'll be complaining about the price when it comes time to settle the account. Rose returned her attention to the delicate stitching, though her mind wandered as it so often did these days. The dreams had been growing stronger lately, more vivid. Grand rooms filled with candlelight and music, faces she did not recognise, turning toward her with expressions she could not decipher, a sense of belonging to something she had never known. She would wake in the darkness of her small chamber, her heart racing, feeling as though she had left something vital behind in that other world. "You're quiet today," Margaret said, setting aside her mending. "More than usual. Just tired," Rose replied, though it was not entirely true. The restlessness that had always lived beneath her skin, that persistent whisper that she was somehow in the wrong place, had grown louder in recent months. She loved Thomas and Margaret with all her heart. They had raised her, fed her, taught her everything she knew about kindness and hard work. Yet there remained an emptiness she could not name, a hollow space that no amount of affection could fill. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Thomas rose with some difficulty, his joints protesting the February cold, and opened it to reveal a tall, sombre man in a dark coat that marked him as someone from beyond their small village. "I am looking for Miss Rose Hartley," the stranger announced, his voice carrying the cultured accent of London, or perhaps Bath. "I am Mr. Edmund Price, solicitor. I have business concerning the late Mrs. Hawthorne." Rose set down her needle, her fingers suddenly cold, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Mrs. Hawthorne, the midwife who had attended every birth in the village for as long as anyone could remember, had died 3 days past. Rose had attended the funeral, standing among the other villagers as they lowered the old woman into the frozen ground. "I am Rose Hartley," she said, rising from her seat, "but I cannot imagine what business you might have with me, sir. I scarcely knew Mrs. Hawthorne beyond the occasional greeting." Mr. Price regarded her with an expression that might have been sympathy. "Nevertheless, madam, Mrs. Hawthorne left specific instructions that certain items be delivered to you upon her death. Might I come inside? The matter is of a delicate nature." Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances, and Rose felt a strange flutter of apprehension in her chest. "Of course," she heard herself say. "Please, come in." The solicitor entered, bringing with him the scent of winter air and expensive tobacco. He carried a leather case under one arm and, more surprisingly, directed 2 men waiting outside to bring in a small but substantial trunk, its wood darkened with age, brass fittings tarnished green. "Mrs. Hawthorne was most insistent," Mr. Price explained, as the men set the trunk down and departed. "She said you were to receive this exactly as she left it, with her letter of instruction." He withdrew a sealed envelope from his case and handed it to Rose. "I was to deliver it personally and ensure you opened it in privacy, should you wish it." Rose stared at the envelope, her name written across it in a spidery hand she recognized as belonging to the late midwife. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and withdrew the single sheet of paper. "Miss Hartley," the letter began without preamble. "By the time you read this, I shall have departed this world and stand before my Maker to answer for the secrets I have kept. For 28 years, I have carried a burden that was never mine to bear alone, yet circumstances and promises made to the dying compelled my silence. The trunk before you contains the truth of your birth and the reason for the strange emptiness you have surely felt all your life. You are not who you believe yourself to be. Open the trunk. Read the diary within. Know that your mother loved you, though she could not keep you. Know that I tried to do right by all involved, though I fear I may have done more harm than good. The past cannot be changed, but perhaps the future can be mended. God forgive me. Mrs. Helena Hawthorne. Rose read the words twice, then a third time, her breath coming shorter with each repetition. Margaret had risen and stood at her shoulder, reading along, her face growing pale. Thomas, Margaret said quietly, perhaps you should take a walk to the village. This may be women's business. The old man looked as though he might protest, but something in his wife's expression stopped him. He gathered his coat and left without another word, closing the door softly behind him. Mr. Price cleared his throat. I shall await outside, Miss Hartley, unless you require my presence. No, Rose managed. Thank you. I will call if I need you. When they were alone, Margaret moved to the trunk and knelt before it. Do you want me to open it, child? Rose found she could not speak, could only nod. Her legs felt unsteady, and she sank back into her chair as Margaret lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay a collection of items that seemed to tell a story Rose did not yet understand. At the very top rested a leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with handling. Beneath it, wrapped in yellowed linen, was a silver locket. Deeper still, Rose glimpsed papers, letters tied with faded ribbon, and a small wooden box. Margaret lifted out the diary first and handed it to Rose. The name embossed on the cover in fading gold leaf made Rose's breath catch in her throat. Lady Eleanor Hartley. Hartley is your name, Margaret whispered. Rose Hartley. We were told nothing of your family when we took you in. Only that you were a babe who needed love and care, and that we must never speak of how you came to us. Rose opened the diary with hands that shook so badly she could barely turn the pages. The entries began in a young woman's graceful script, dated more than 30 years past. She skipped ahead, scanning for anything that might explain this impossible situation, until her eyes caught on a date that stopped her heart. April 12th, 1795. The twins were born this morning as dawn broke over the gardens. Two perfect girls, identical in every way, from their green eyes to the small mark upon their left shoulders. I should be filled with joy, but I am terrified. Father knows. He has invoked the old family curse, that superstition that has haunted the Hartley line for generations. Twins bring misfortune and death, he says. One must not live. He has ordered it done before nightfall. God help me, what am I to do? Rose's vision blurred. She forced herself to keep reading, turning pages with numb fingers. April 13th, 1795. Helena Hawthorne has saved us. Saved one of them, at least. Last night, while Father slept in his study, drunk on brandy and rage, Helena spirited the smaller twin away. We told him this morning that she had died in the night, too weak to survive. He seemed satisfied. The other baby, the one I am allowed to keep, I have named Isabella. She will grow up as my legitimate daughter, heir to whatever fortune the Hartley name can still claim. The other child, my secret daughter, will be raised by good people far from here. Helena knows a family in Somerset, honest farmers who recently lost their own baby to fever. They will love her, Helena promises. They will never know who she truly is. I have given Helena all the money I could gather, enough to ensure the child's comfort. I pray it will be enough. I pray God will forgive me for this choice. I pray my hidden daughter will forgive me, should she ever learn the truth. The diary entry continued, but Rose could read no more. She set the book aside and reached for the silver locket, opening it with trembling fingers. Inside were two tiny portraits, so skillfully rendered that they seemed almost alive. On the left, a young woman with kind eyes and auburn hair. On the right, a baby with a delicate face and a wisp of dark hair. That's you, Margaret breathed, pointing to the baby. That was painted when you were perhaps 3 months old. I remember Helena bringing it, though she would never say where it came from. Beneath the locket lay an official document, yellowed with age, but still legible. A certificate of birth, registered in the parish of Harrington, recording the arrival of twin girls to Eleanor Margaret Hartley, wife of Viscount Hartley, on the 12th day of April in the year of our Lord 1795. The names listed were Isabella Catherine Hartley and Rose Eleanor Hartley. Rose stared at her own name written in that formal hand, proof of an identity she had never known she possessed. She was not merely Rose Hartley, seamstress of Somerset. She was Rose Eleanor Hartley, daughter of a viscount, twin sister to someone named Isabella. Why? The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. Why did they separate us? Margaret had been sorting through the other papers in the trunk. She now held a letter, more recent than the diary entries, written in the same spidery hand as the one Mr. Price had delivered. This explains more, Margaret said gently, handing it over. Rose read, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. My dear girl, if you are reading this, then you know the truth at last. Lady Eleanor died 6 months past, having never found the courage to seek you out, though she thought of you every day of her life. She left me this trunk with instructions that it be delivered to you upon my own death. I have delayed this responsibility too long, fearing what it might do to you, but I am old now, and my time is short. You have a family you never knew. Your father, Viscount Hartley, died 2 years ago, never knowing of your existence. Your mother took that secret to her grave, but your sister, your twin, lived. Her name was Isabella. She married well, to a duke no less, the Duke of Greystone, Christopher Whitmore. They were married these past 5 years. I write was because I must tell you terrible news. Isabella died 3 weeks ago, lost to childbed fever after delivering a stillborn son. The Duke is said to be mad with grief. The funeral was held last week. You are the last living child of Eleanor and Geoffrey Hartley, the last of that particular line. I do not know what you will choose to do with this knowledge. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps you will burn these papers and continue your life as it has been. But I felt you deserved to know the truth. You deserved to know why you have always felt as though something was missing. It was because something was missing. Someone. Your other half. The sister who lived the life that might have been yours. Forgive an old woman her conscience. I hope I have not caused more pain than healing. Rose let the letter fall from her fingers. Isabella, her twin sister, the woman who had shared her first breath, who carried the same face, the same blood. Dead, dead, before Rose had even known she existed. Oh, my dear child, Margaret murmured, kneeling beside Rose's chair and taking her cold hands. I am so sorry. We never knew. Thomas and I, we were told only that you were a babe who needed a home. Helena said your mother had died, and there was no one else. We loved you from the first moment. You must believe that. I do believe it, Rose heard herself say, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. I have never doubted your love. Never. But even as she spoke, her mind was racing ahead, making connections, understanding at last the source of that persistent restlessness. She had been incomplete all her life because half of her had been living a separate existence. A sister, a twin. And now that sister was gone, taking with her any chance of the reunion Rose had not even known to long for. What will you do? Margaret asked softly. Rose looked at the pile of documents, the diary, the locket. Then she looked at the small cottage that had been her entire world for 28 years. I need to go to Hampshire, she said slowly. I need to see where Isabella lived. I need to understand the life she had, the life I might have had. You want to see the Duke? I want to see my sister's grave, Rose corrected. I want to stand where she stood. I want to know who she was. She paused, then added more quietly, I need to know if she ever felt it too. That sense of something missing. I need to know if she dreamed of me the way I dreamed of her. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Finally, she rose and moved to the small chest where she and Thomas kept their modest savings. Then you shall go, she said firmly. Thomas and I have set aside a bit over the years. It's not much, but it will be enough for the public carriage and lodging along the way. I cannot take your money, Rose protested, but Margaret silenced her with a look. You are our daughter in every way that matters, Rose Hartley. If you need to make this journey, then we will help you make it. She pressed a small leather purse into Rose's hands. Go, find your answers. But promise me you'll write every week. Promise me you'll come back to us. Rose embraced the woman who had raised her, feeling the familiar comfort of those thin arms. I promise, I will always come back. You and Thomas are my family, no matter what that certificate says. But even as she made the promise, she felt the pull of something unknown, something that had been calling to her all her life. In Hampshire, there was a grave that bore her sister's name. There was a duke who grieved for the woman who had worn Rose's face. There were answers to questions she had carried in her bones without ever knowing how to ask them. 3 days later, Rose climbed into the public carriage bound for Hampshire, carrying only the trunk Mrs. Hawthorne had left her and a small bag of practical clothing. Margaret and Thomas stood in the cold morning air, waving until the carriage rounded the bend and disappeared from view. Rose settled into her seat, conscious of the curious glances from the other passengers. A young woman travelling alone was unusual enough to warrant attention, though no one spoke to her directly. She was grateful for the silence. It gave her time to think, to try to make sense of the impossible truth that had upended her world. The journey took 3 days. 3 nights spent in roadside inns where she shared rooms with other female travellers and ate simple meals in common rooms filled with strangers. She wrote to Margaret and Thomas as promised, brief notes assuring them of her safety. But mostly she sat alone, staring out windows at the passing countryside, her mind a whirl of questions without answers. What had Isabella been like? Had she been happy in her marriage to the Duke? Had she known, somewhere deep in her soul, that she had a sister she had never met? And the Duke himself, what manner of man was he to inspire such tales of grief? As the carriage rolled through the Hampshire countryside on the afternoon of the 3rd day, Rose pressed her face to the window, watching for some sign of the grand estate where her sister had lived and died. The landscape had changed, the gentle rolling hills of Somerset giving way to more dramatic terrain. Bare trees, stark against fields, still touched with winter's frost. Greystone Manor is just ahead, the driver called down. Anyone bound for the estate should prepare to disembark. Rose's heart began to pound. She gathered her belongings, smoothing the wrinkles from her plain wool travelling dress. She had not thought about what she would say when she arrived, how she would explain herself. What did one say when presenting oneself as the secret twin of a dead duchess? The carriage rolled through impressive iron gates and up a long drive lined with ancient oaks. And then the house came into view, and Rose's breath caught in her throat. It was magnificent, a sprawling structure of pale stone that seemed to glow in the weak winter sunlight. Dozens of windows looked out over manicured grounds, and smoke rose from multiple chimneys into the grey sky. This was where Isabella had lived, this palace that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The carriage came to a halt before the main entrance. Rose climbed down, her legs unsteady after 3 days of travel, and stood looking up at the grand facade. Only then did she notice the unusual number of carriages parked along the drive, the dark-clothed figures moving about the grounds. A servant in formal livery approached her, his expression confused. "Miss, this is a private residence. The family is not receiving visitors today." "I apologize," Rose began, but her words were cut short by a sudden commotion near the house. The great doors had opened, and a procession of people dressed in mourning black was emerging. Rose understood with sudden, sickening clarity what was happening. She had arrived on the day of Isabella's memorial service. The servant's confusion turned to alarm as Rose walked past him, drawn toward the procession by a force she could not name. She moved through the gathering of mourners as though in a dream, her worn travelling dress and simple bonnet marking her as someone who did not belong among the silk and fine wool that surrounded her. The mourners had assembled on the broad steps leading down from the house, creating a pathway for the clergy who stood at the entrance to the private chapel. Rose found herself at the edge of the crowd, close enough to see their faces, the grief etched into aristocratic features, the whispered conversations behind gloved hands. And then she saw him. The Duke of Greystone stood at the centre of the gathering, tall and imposing in his black mourning clothes. His face was drawn, colourless, as though all the vitality had been leached from him. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his blue eyes stared straight ahead with a terrible emptiness that made Rose's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. He was receiving condolences, accepting the murmured words of comfort with mechanical nods, when his gaze drifted across the crowd and landed on Rose. The change in his expression was instantaneous. Colour flooded his face, then drained away just as quickly. His mouth opened as though to speak, but no sound emerged. He took a single unsteady step forward, one hand reaching out as if to touch something that could not be real. Isabella! The word escaped him as barely more than a breath. But in the sudden hush that had fallen over the assembly, it carried clearly. Rose stood frozen, understanding too late what her arrival must mean to these people, what her face must mean to the man who had loved her sister. She watched as the Duke's eyes rolled back in his head, and his knees buckled. Two men in formal livery caught him before he hit the ground, their faces pale with shock as they lowered him carefully onto the stone steps. The crowd erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men shouted for doctors, for smelling salts, for explanations. And through it all, 100 pairs of eyes turned to Rose, staring at her face with expressions that ranged from terror to fury to awed disbelief. "It's a ghost," someone whispered, and the word spread through the assembly like wildfire. "The Duchess has returned from the grave." "Witchcraft," an older woman declared, her voice shrill with fear. "This is dark magic." "No," Rose tried to say, but her voice was lost in the tumult. She took a step back, then another, wanting nothing more than to flee this terrible scene she had inadvertently created. But her retreat was blocked by the press of people who had surged forward, some to help the Duke, others to get a better look at the impossible woman who wore a dead Duchess's face. A woman pushed through the crowd, her expression thunderous beneath her elegant black veil. She was perhaps 40, with sharp features and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. "What manner of fraud is this?" "I am not a fraud," Rose managed, though her legs felt weak beneath her. "My name is Rose Hartley. I did not mean to cause such disruption. I only learned recently that I had a sister, that Isabella was my twin. I came to pay my respects, to see where she lived. I did not know there would be a memorial service today." "Sister?" The woman's eyes narrowed dangerously. The Duchess had no sister. This is clearly some scheme to prey upon the Duke in his grief. "Guards, remove this woman from the grounds at once." 2 footmen moved toward Rose, but before they could reach her, a voice rang out from where the Duke lay on the steps. "Wait." Christopher Whitmore had regained consciousness, though he remained seated on the stone, supported by the men who had caught him. His face was still unnaturally pale, but his eyes were fixed on Rose with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Bring her closer. I would see her properly." The crowd parted reluctantly, and Rose found herself propelled forward by hands that were not gentle. She stopped a few feet from where the Duke sat, close enough now to see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of beard on his jaw, the tremor in his hands as he stared at her. "You are not Isabella," he said finally, and there was such desolation in his voice that Rose felt tears prick her eyes. "You cannot be. I saw her buried. I stood at her grave and watched them lower her into the earth." "No, Your Grace," Rose replied quietly. "I am Rose, Isabella's twin sister. We were separated at birth. I only learned of her existence 3 days ago, and of her death. I have proof, documents that explain everything, but I did not come here to cause you pain. I came because I needed to understand who my sister was, the life she led. I am sorry for intruding on your grief." "Twin sister," the Duke repeated, as though testing the words. "Isabella never mentioned a twin." "She did not know of my existence, Your Grace. Our mother separated us as infants due to a family superstition about twins. Isabella was raised as the legitimate daughter of Viscount Hartley. I was given to a family in Somerset and raised as a common seamstress. Neither of us knew the other existed until it was too late." A man who had been standing near the Duke stepped forward, his expression skeptical. He was shorter than Christopher, with thinning grey hair and the demeanour of someone accustomed to questioning claims. "This is preposterous," he announced. "The Duchess had no siblings, twin or otherwise. This woman is clearly an impostor, hoping to exploit the Duke's vulnerable state. I insist she be removed and charges brought against her for attempted fraud." "Lord Percival speaks sense," the sharp-featured woman agreed. "We should send for the magistrate at once." But Christopher raised a hand, silencing them both. "What proof do you have?" he asked Rose, his voice hoarse. "You claim documents. Show them." Rose's hands shook as she opened the small bag she carried and withdrew the papers Mrs. Hawthorne had left her. The certificate of birth, yellowed but still legible. The diary entries in Lady Eleanor's handwriting. The locket with the miniature portraits. She held them out, and Christopher took them with careful hands, as though they might crumble at his touch. He read in silence, his face expressionless, while the assembled mourners watched with bated breath. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the bare trees and the rustle of paper as the Duke turned pages. Finally, he looked up at Rose, and she saw recognition in his eyes. Not of her, but of the truth in what she carried. "These appear genuine," he said slowly. "The handwriting is Lady Eleanor's. I saw her correspondence often enough during Isabella's life to recognize it." He turned to address the crowd, his voice gaining strength. "I will not make a hasty judgment on this matter. This woman will remain here as my guest while we investigate her claims thoroughly. If she speaks true, then she is my sister by marriage and deserves to be treated with respect. If she lies, then justice will be served. But I will not turn away someone who may be the last living connection to my wife without proper inquiry." "Christopher, you cannot be serious," Lady Beatrix protested. "She could be dangerous. She could be part of some larger plot." "Then she will be watched," the Duke replied firmly. He struggled to his feet, waving off the hands that reached to steady him. "Mrs. Pemberton, have a room prepared in the servants' quarters. See that Miss Hartley is fed and provided with necessities. Place a guard at her door if it makes you feel better." But she stays. A formidable woman in a housekeeper's black dress stepped forward, her expression disapproving but obedient. "Yes, Your Grace. As you wish." Christopher turned back to Rose, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, some emotion too complex to name. "You claim to have loved my wife, though you never met her. I find I must know if that is possible. Come inside, but know that every word you speak, every document you present, will be scrutinized by the finest legal minds in Hampshire. If you are what you claim, you have nothing to fear. If you are not, then you will regret the day you came to Greystone Manor." With that, he turned and walked back into the house, leaving Rose to follow under the hostile gazes of Lady Beatrix, Lord Percival, and 100 other mourners who clearly believed she was the worst sort of charlatan. Mrs. Pemberton gripped Rose's arm with surprising strength and guided her away from the memorial service, through a side entrance into the great house. They moved down corridors lined with portraits and through rooms so grand that Rose felt increasingly small and out of place. Finally, they climbed a narrow staircase to the upper floors where the servants lived, and Rose was shown into a small chamber with a single bed, a washstand, and a chair. "You'll stay here until His Grace determines what to do with you," Mrs. Pemberton announced. "I'll send up a maid with water and food. There's a guard outside your door, so don't think of trying to escape or steal anything. We'll be watching you." When the housekeeper had gone, Rose sank onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. The journey that had seemed so simple in Somerset, so necessary, had become a nightmare. She had not considered how her appearance might affect those who had loved Isabella. She had not imagined the Duke's face when he saw her. The hope and horror mingled in his expression. A soft knock at the door made her look up. A young maid entered, carrying a tray with bread, cheese, and weak tea. She set it on the small table without meeting Rose's eyes, clearly frightened. "Thank you," Rose said gently, but the girl fled without responding. The week that followed was the strangest of Rose's life. She remained confined to the small room, allowed out only for brief walks in the kitchen garden under the watchful eyes of a footman. But each day brought visitors. First came the Duke's solicitors, stern men in dark coats who questioned her relentlessly about every detail of her story. Where had she lived? Who had raised her? How had she learned of Isabella? They examined the documents she carried with painful thoroughness, comparing handwriting samples, verifying dates, checking official records. On the third day, they left to travel to Somerset and speak with Thomas and Margaret Davy to confirm that Rose had indeed been raised by them from infancy. On the fourth day, they went to the parish where the birth certificate had been registered to examine the original entries in the church records. On the fifth day, the Duke's personal physician examined Rose, measuring her features, noting the distinctive green of her eyes, the small birthmark on her left shoulder blade that, he informed her quietly, had been identical to one Isabella bore. Through it all, Rose saw nothing of the Duke himself. He had retreated to some private part of the house, and the servants whispered that he spent his days in Isabella's chambers, which he had ordered preserved exactly as she had left them. On the seventh day, The solicitors returned with their final report. Rose was summoned to the Duke's study, a grand room lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive desk of dark wood. Christopher stood at the window, his back to her, looking out over the winter gardens. "The investigation is complete," he said without turning. "Every document you provided has been verified as genuine. The parish records confirm the birth of twin girls to Lady Eleanor Hartley on the date specified. The vicar who made the entry has been dead these 15 years, but his records are meticulous. Your parents, Thomas and Margaret Davy, confirm that you were brought to them as an infant by the midwife Mrs. Hawthorne, along with enough money to ensure your comfort. Mrs. Hawthorne's testimony, recorded before her death, corroborates every detail of your story." He paused, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. "You are who you claim to be. Rose Eleanor Hartley, twin sister to my late wife, daughter of Viscount Geoffrey Hartley and Lady Eleanor Hartley. You are, by blood and law, a member of the Hartley family, though your upbringing was far from what it should have been." He turned then, and Rose saw that his face had changed in the week since she had arrived. The sharp shock of grief had given way to something more resigned, a weariness that aged him beyond his 32 years. "I owe you an apology," he continued. "You were treated as a criminal when you came here in good faith, seeking only to understand your heritage. That was wrong of us, wrong of me. You have been terribly used by fate, Miss Hartley. First denied your rightful place in the world, and then denied even the chance to know your sister before she was taken from us both." "Your Grace," Rose began, but he held up a hand. "I would like to offer you a place here, if you wish it, not in the servants' quarters, but as a guest, as family. You have every right to know who Isabella was, to see the life she lived. I can offer you that, and more. A proper allowance, quarters befitting your station, introductions to society as Isabella's sister. It is the least I can do to make amends for the injustice done to you." Rose was silent for a long moment, considering. She thought of Thomas and Margaret waiting in Somerset. She thought of the small cottage that had been her entire world. And she thought of the sister she had never known, whose face she wore, whose life she might have lived. "I would like to stay," she said finally, "for a time at least. I want to understand who Isabella was. I want to know the woman who shared my blood, even if I can never truly know her. And then, when I have my answers, I will return to Somerset. That is my home, whatever my birth certificate might say." Something that might have been respect flickered in Christopher's eyes. "I understand. You shall have your answers, Miss Hartley. And when you are ready to leave, you will do so with my gratitude and whatever assistance I can provide." He rang a bell, and Mrs. Pemberton appeared with surprising swiftness. Her expression was considerably warmer than it had been the week before. "Mrs. Pemberton, please have Miss Hartley's belongings moved to the blue guest suite in the west wing. See that she has everything she needs. She is to be treated as a member of the family from this moment forward." The housekeeper curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace. At once, Your Grace." As Rose followed Mrs. Pemberton from the study, she glanced back to see Christopher standing once more at the window, his face turned away, a figure of such loneliness that it made her heart ache. She had come seeking a sister and found only a grave. But she had also found a man whose grief mirrored her own sense of loss, and she wondered if, in time, they might help each other bear the weight of what they had both lost. April had arrived at Greystone Manor, bringing with it the tentative promise of spring. The gardens that had been bare and frozen during Rose's arrival now showed the first green shoots pushing through the dark earth, crocuses blooming in purple and white clusters beneath the ancient oaks. Yet inside the great house, winter seemed to have taken permanent residence in certain rooms, most notably in the chambers that had belonged to the late Duchess. Rose stood in the doorway of Isabella's suite, her hand resting on the frame, unable to bring herself to enter uninvited. 5 weeks had passed since the memorial service. 5 weeks since Christopher had officially welcomed her as family. In that time, she had learned that grief could preserve things as effectively as any embalming fluid. Nothing in these rooms had been moved or changed since the day Isabella died. The curtains remained drawn, casting everything in perpetual twilight. Her dressing gown still lay across the chair where she had left it. A book rested open on the bedside table, its pages frozen at whatever passage she had been reading. And above the fireplace, hung the portrait that had become the center of Christopher's daily ritual. It showed Isabella seated in a garden, one hand resting on her rounded belly, her face lit with the gentle smile of expectant motherhood. The artist had captured something ineffable in her expression, a combination of hope and serenity that made Rose's chest ache with loss for the sister she had never known. "He comes here every morning," a soft voice said behind her. Rose turned to find Sarah, one of the younger housemaids, carrying fresh linens. "His Grace, I mean, sits in that chair by the fire and talks to her portrait as though she might answer him. Sometimes for an hour or more." "What does he say?" Rose asked, then immediately regretted the intrusion. "Forgive me, I should not have asked." Sarah glanced down the corridor to ensure they were alone before answering. "I've heard him apologize, miss, for not saving her and the baby, for failing them both. It breaks your heart to hear it." The maid's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "The little master was born sleeping, they say, never drew breath. Her Grace held him once, kissed his forehead, and then the fever took her away too, all within hours." Rose felt the information settle heavily in her chest. A nephew she would never meet, a child who had existed for 9 months in his mother's womb, only to slip away before truly living. What was to be his name? "Edmund Christopher," Sarah replied. "After his Grace's father and himself, they had the name chosen for weeks." The weight of that loss, layered atop Isabella's death, made Rose understand Christopher's haunted expression in a new light. He had not lost one person, but two, a wife and a son, his entire future erased in a single terrible night. "Thank you for telling me," Rose said quietly. "I needed to know." After Sarah departed, Rose made her way to her own chambers in the West Wing, a journey that took her through corridors lined with portraits of Whitmore ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress. Her rooms were far grander than anything she had known in Somerset. 3 connected chambers with tall windows overlooking the East Gardens. Yet she found herself most comfortable in the smallest of the 3, a sitting room with a writing desk where she composed her weekly letters to Margaret and Thomas. She settled at the desk now, drawing out fresh paper and dipping her pen in ink. "Dearest Margaret and Thomas," she wrote, "another week has passed, and I find myself still quite lost in this strange new world. Yesterday at dinner, I used the wrong fork for the fish course, and felt Lady Marguerite's disapproving gaze like a physical weight. The Duke's aunt has taken it upon herself to transform me into something resembling a lady, though I fear the task may prove impossible. Tomorrow my lessons in deportment begin in earnest. I confess I'm dreading it." She paused, considering how much to reveal about Christopher's grief, then decided against burdening them with such intimate details. Instead, she wrote of the library she had discovered, 3 stories of books that she was slowly exploring, and of the servants who were beginning to warm to her despite her common origins. "Mrs. Pemberton allowed me to help in the kitchen this morning," she continued. "I know I should not, that it is beneath my supposed station now, but I cannot simply sit idle while others work. I showed cook how Margaret makes her apple tart, and I do believe she was pleased with the result. These small moments of useful purpose are the only times I feel like myself in this grand place." She signed the letter with love, sealed it carefully, and set it aside for the morning post. Then she turned her attention to the stack of correspondence that Mrs. Pemberton had brought her earlier, letters that had belonged to Isabella, carefully preserved in a wooden box. Rose had been reading through them methodically, trying to piece together the woman her sister had been. The letters revealed someone gentle and thoughtful, prone to worrying about the welfare of servants and tenants, devoted to her charitable work with the village school. There was kindness in every line, but also a fragility, a sense that Isabella had been sheltered from the harsher realities of life. One letter in particular caught Rose's attention, written to a friend shortly after Isabella's marriage to Christopher. "I confess, I am quite overwhelmed by all the duties expected of a duchess," Isabella had written. "Christopher is patient with my mistakes, but I fear I disappoint him with my ignorance of estate management and social obligations. He speaks of investments and agricultural reforms, and I can only nod and smile, understanding perhaps one word in 3. Yet he is kind, always kind, and I find myself caring for him more with each passing day. Perhaps in time I shall prove worthy of the position he has given me." Rose set the letter down, feeling an unexpected kinship with this sister she had never met. Both of them thrust into worlds they were unprepared for, struggling to find their footing, afraid of disappointing those around them. Yet where Isabella had been born to this life and still found it difficult, Rose came from even further outside its boundaries. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Sarah or one of the other maids. Instead, Christopher entered, his expression uncertain. It was the first time he had sought her out in her private chambers, and Rose stood quickly, smoothing her plain day dress. "Your Grace," she said, "I did not expect you." "I should have sent word," he replied, remaining near the door as though ready to flee at any moment. "I wanted to inform you that my aunt, Lady Marguerite, will be calling tomorrow morning to begin your instruction in proper deportment. She can be rather exacting, but her intentions are good." "I understand," Rose replied, though her stomach tightened with apprehension. "I am grateful for her assistance, though I confess I may prove a poor student." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Christopher's face. "Mrs. Pemberton tells me you were in the kitchen this morning, teaching Cook a new recipe." Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I know I should not have. It was presumptuous of me to interfere with the household routine. I promise it will not happen again." "That is not why I mention it," Christopher said, taking a few steps into the room. "The staff speak well of you. They appreciate your willingness to treat them as equals rather than inferiors. It is a quality Isabella shared, though she expressed it differently." He paused, his eyes moving to the letters scattered across Rose's desk. "You have been reading her correspondence?" "Mrs. Pemberton said I might," Rose replied quickly. "I wanted to understand who Isabella was, what she cared about. I hope that was not wrong of me." "No," Christopher said quietly. "It is natural that you should wish to know her, though I must warn you that reading her words may make her loss feel more real, more painful." "It already feels quite real," Rose admitted, "knowing she existed, that she was my twin, my other half, and that I will never have the chance to meet her. It is a grief I did not anticipate. Mourning someone I never knew." Christopher moved to the window, his profile silhouetted against the afternoon light. "She would have wanted to know you, I think. Isabella always felt something was missing in her life, some connection she could not name. In the early days of our marriage, she would wake from dreams she could not remember and weep without understanding why. Perhaps, on some level, she sensed your existence." The possibility hung between them, beautiful and heartbreaking. Rose found herself blinking back tears. "I had the same dreams," she whispered. "Always. Visions of grand rooms and faces I did not recognize, a persistent feeling that I was somehow incomplete. Now I understand why." Christopher turned to face her, and for the first time since her arrival, his expression softened into something approaching warmth. "You look like her, but you are not her. I see that now, more clearly with each passing day. Isabella was raised to be a duchess, trained from birth in all the proper behaviors and expectations. You were raised to be self-sufficient, to work with your hands, to find value in service rather than in being served. Neither way is better than the other. They are simply different. Yet I must learn to be more like her if I am to exist in this world without embarrassing you," Rose replied. "You could never embarrass me," Christopher said firmly, "but you may find your time here more comfortable if you understand the unspoken rules that govern society. Lady Marguerite can teach you those rules. Whether you choose to follow them is entirely your decision." After he departed, Rose sat for a long time in the gathering dusk, thinking about his words and about the sister who had shared her restless dreams. Somewhere in the mysteries of blood and birth, they had been connected despite the miles and circumstances that separated them. And now Rose walked through rooms Isabella had once inhabited, slept under the same roof, took meals at the same table where Isabella had sat across from the husband who still grieved her. The following morning brought Lady Marguerite, Christopher's aunt, a formidable woman of 60 with iron-grey hair and the posture of a military general. She swept into Rose's sitting room, accompanied by 2 servants carrying various implements, books balanced on their heads, a large mirror on a wheeled stand. "Stand," Lady Marguerite commanded without preamble. "Let me see what we are working with." Rose stood, feeling painfully conscious of the way she unconsciously slouched, the habits of a lifetime spent bent over sewing. "Dreadful," Lady Marguerite pronounced. "Your shoulders curve inward like a scullery maid's. Your chin tilts downward in perpetual submission. And your walk, well, we shall address that shortly. But first, posture. What followed were the most excruciating hours of Rose's life. Lady Marguerite had her stand against a wall with a book balanced on her head, shoulders pressed back until her spine ached. Then came walking lessons, endless circuits of the room, while the older woman critiqued every step. "You lumber like a farm wife carrying buckets," Lady Marguerite declared. "A lady glides. She moves as though the ground beneath her is made of clouds, not common earth." "I am a farm wife's daughter," Rose replied through gritted teeth, earning a sharp rap on her shoulder from Lady Marguerite's fan. "You are the sister of a duchess and must conduct yourself accordingly." Again. They moved on to curtsying, to the proper way of entering and exiting a room, to the complex hierarchy of social greetings. Rose's head spun with instructions. Never turn your back on a person of higher rank. Always allow the hostess to sit first. The depth of your curtsy must correspond precisely to the station of the person you greet. "And your accent," Lady Marguerite continued mercilessly. "That rural Somerset burr must be softened. You drop your final consonants and swallow your vowels like a common tavern girl. Repeat after me. The rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain." Rose attempted the phrase, but her tongue rebelled against the unfamiliar precision of pronunciation Lady Marguerite demanded. "Hopeless," the older woman sighed. "We shall work on it daily until your speech reflects your breeding rather than your upbringing." By the time Lady Marguerite departed, Rose felt as though she had been trampled by horses. Every muscle ached from holding unnatural positions. Her head throbbed from the effort of remembering countless rules. She collapsed onto the settee in her sitting room and seriously considered fleeing back to Somerset that very night. A gentle knock announced Sarah's arrival with tea. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you look done in." "Lady Marguerite is a tyrant," Rose muttered, accepting the tea gratefully. "Aye, but a necessary one," Sarah replied with sympathy. "She transformed 3 nieces from country misses into proper ladies who all married well. If anyone can teach you what you need to know, it's her." "But I do not wish to be transformed," Rose protested. "I am content with who I am." Sarah regarded her thoughtfully. "If you'll forgive me saying so, miss, you don't have to become someone else entirely. You just need to learn the language they speak in this world. Think of it like learning French. You don't stop being English just because you can speak another tongue." The wisdom in those words settled something in Rose's chest. Perhaps she could learn these skills without losing herself in the process. Perhaps she could master the rules of society while still maintaining the core of who she was. Over the following weeks, Rose submitted herself to Lady Marguerite's rigorous instruction. Posture and deportment in the mornings. French conversation in the afternoons, though Rose struggled with the unfamiliar sounds. Dance lessons 3 times weekly, learning the complex steps of country dances and waltzes. Lessons in watercolours and pianoforte, both of which came more naturally to her than the social graces. Yet through it all, Rose maintained her own small rebellions. She continued to help in the kitchen when she could, to visit the stables and befriend the horses, to walk in the gardens and get her hands dirty, planting seeds alongside the gardeners. The servants began to look forward to her presence, this strange lady who did not act quite like a lady should. And slowly, imperceptibly, the household began to adapt to accommodate her. Cook started leaving simple tasks for Rose to help with. The head gardener consulted her about the kitchen garden. Even Mrs. Pemberton began to soften, occasionally smiling at Rose's earnest attempts to navigate the complex world she now inhabited. Christopher observed these changes from a distance, still locked in his own grief, but unable to entirely ignore the disruption Rose brought to his carefully preserved morning. He would encounter her in unexpected places, kneeling in the dirt beside a gardener, laughing with a scullery maid, her face lit with genuine joy at simple pleasures Isabella had never thought to pursue. She was so unlike his late wife, yet she wore Isabella's face, creating a strange cognitive dissonance that left him unsettled and increasingly curious about the woman his sister by marriage was becoming. June arrived with the soft warmth of early summer, transforming the grounds of Greystone Manor into a tapestry of green punctuated by blooming roses and lavender. As she knelt beside one of the long borders with the undergardener, the sharp, clean scent of lavender rose around her. Rose brushed her fingertips along the purple spikes, smiling despite herself. "I think this is my favorite," she confessed, lifting her hand to her nose. "It smells honest. Not cloying or showy, just quietly there." Her Grace preferred the white roses, the boy replied. Said they made the whole garden look as if it were holding its breath. Then the roses can remain hers, Rose said softly. And the lavender can be mine. 3 months had passed since Rose's startling appearance at Isabella's memorial service, and in that time, the household had settled into an uneasy accommodation of her presence. Yet beyond the estate's iron gates, London society had erupted into furious debate about the seamstress who claimed kinship with a dead duchess. Rose learned of this controversy through the steady stream of correspondence that arrived at the manor. Letters addressed to Christopher that often found their way to his desk unread, while he retreated further into his private grief. It was Mrs. Pemberton who finally brought the matter to Rose's attention one morning in early June, finding her in the kitchen garden where she had been helping the undergardener plant herbs. Miss Hartley, the housekeeper said, her tone disapproving of Rose's dirt-stained hands and simple cotton dress. You have been invited to Lady Thornbury's summer ball. It is to be held a fortnight hence in London. His Grace wishes to know if you will attend. Rose sat back on her heels, wiping soil from her fingers. A ball? I have never attended such an event in my life. Surely my presence would only cause more scandal. The scandal exists regardless, Mrs. Pemberton replied bluntly. Half of London believes you are an impostor seeking to enrich yourself through deception. The other half finds your story romantic and compelling. Either way, you are the subject of considerable gossip. His Grace feels it would be wise to present you formally to society, to demonstrate that you have his support and are indeed who you claim to be. Rose felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. What does Lady Marguerite say? That you are as ready as you will ever be, though your tendency to speak your mind will likely create difficulties. The housekeeper's expression softened slightly. You have learned the steps of the dances, Miss Hartley. You know which fork to use and how to curtsy to a duchess. The rest is simply a matter of not allowing them to intimidate you. That afternoon, Christopher sought Rose out in the library, where she had been attempting to lose herself in a volume of Wordsworth's poetry. He entered quietly, and she looked up to find him studying her with an expression she could not quite decipher. You have heard about the ball, he said, not quite a question. Mrs. Pemberton informed me this morning. I confess I am terrified at the prospect. Christopher moved to the window, his habitual refuge when uncomfortable with conversation. I would not ask this of you if I did not believe it necessary. The rumours surrounding your arrival have become increasingly absurd. Last week, I heard you described as a French spy who murdered Isabella and assumed her identity. The week before, someone suggested you were Isabella herself, risen from the grave through unholy means. Despite her anxiety, Rose felt a laugh escape. I assure you, I am neither a spy nor a revenant, merely an unfortunate woman, born with an inconvenient face. Your face is not inconvenient, Christopher replied, turning to meet her eyes. Though I admit it was deeply unsettling at first, but I have come to see the differences now. Isabella never laughed as you do, with such abandon. She never challenged my opinions or questioned the natural order of things. She certainly never planted herbs in the kitchen garden or taught the scullery maids to read. Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks. I did not realize you knew about that. Little happens in this house without my knowledge, even if I choose not to interfere. He paused, then added more softly, You have brought something to Greystone Manor that has been missing since Isabella's death. Not joy, precisely, but life, movement, change. The servants speak of you with affection rather than fear. The children in the village wait for your visits. Even my aunt, for all her criticisms, admits you have worked harder at your lessons than any student she has ever taught. The unexpected praise left Rose momentarily speechless. Your Grace, I do not know what to say. Say you will attend the ball. Let society see you as I have come to see you, as someone worthy of respect in your own right, not merely as Isabella's shadow. Rose considered his words, then nodded slowly. I will attend, though I make no promises to behave with perfect propriety if I encounter the sort of cruelty and prejudice I have read about in those letters. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Christopher's face. I would expect nothing less. The following days passed in a flurry of preparation. A dressmaker was summoned from London to create a gown suitable for Rose's first formal appearance, measuring and pinning while Rose stood still as a dressmaker's form. Lady Marguerite intensified her instruction, drilling Rose on the proper forms of address for every conceivable rank and title, the intricate dance of social hierarchy that governed every interaction. "You will curtsy thus to a duchess," Lady Marguerite demonstrated, sinking into an elaborate bow. "Slightly less for a marchioness, a simple inclination of the head for a baroness, unless you wish to flatter her, in which case a small curtsy is acceptable. And above all, you must never, ever contradict a member of the royal family, should you be so fortunate or unfortunate as to encounter one." "What if the royal family member is wrong?" Rose asked, earning an exasperated sigh from her instructor. "Then they are wrong with great authority, and you agree with them nonetheless. This is the way of our world, my dear, whether you approve or not." As the day of the ball approached, Christopher began inviting Rose to join him for morning rides across the estate. They would set out as the sun burned off the early mist, riding through woods and meadows while the world was still quiet and new. During these excursions, away from the watchful eyes of servants and society, something shifted between them. Christopher spoke of his childhood, of a father who valued duty above affection, and a mother who died when he was barely 10 years old. Rose shared her own memories of growing up in Somerset, of Margaret's patient teaching and Thomas's quiet wisdom, of learning to find beauty in simple things. A well-made stitch, bread rising in the oven, the first snowdrops pushing through frozen ground. "Isabella would have loved your mother," Christopher said one morning as they paused to rest the horses beside a stream. "Margaret, I mean, the woman who raised you. Isabella always felt most comfortable around people who were kind without calculation, who gave freely without expecting return." "What was she like?" Rose asked, the question that had haunted her for months finally finding voice. Not the perfect duchess everyone describes, but the real woman. What made her laugh? What frightened her? What did she dream about when she could not sleep? Christopher was silent for so long that Rose thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. She was gentle, almost to a fault. She cried over injured birds and worried endlessly about the welfare of people she scarcely knew. She loved music, but was too shy to play for anyone except me. She dreamed of having many children, of filling Greystone Manor with laughter and noise. He paused, pain evident in his expression. She was terrified of childbirth. She had seen her own mother die that way when she was young, and the fear haunted her throughout her pregnancy. In the end, her fears proved prophetic. "I am sorry," Rose said softly, "for your loss and for hers, for the child who never drew breath, for all the dreams that died with them." "Why do you not resent her?" Christopher asked suddenly. "Isabella lived the life that should have been yours. She had wealth, position, everything you were denied by an accident of birth and superstition. Yet you speak of her with compassion rather than bitterness." Rose considered the question carefully. "Because resenting her would change nothing. She did not choose to be kept while I was sent away, any more than I chose my fate. We were both victims of our grandfather's fear and our mother's impossible choice. And because, in a strange way, I have come to love her. Reading her letters, learning about her kindness, seeing the good she did in this world, how can I feel anything but affection for the sister I never knew?" Christopher's eyes held hers for a long moment, and Rose felt something pass between them, a connection that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. She recognized the danger in these quiet mornings, in the growing ease of their conversations, in the way her heart quickened when she saw him approach. This was her sister's husband, a man still deep in mourning. Whatever she felt or thought she felt must be suppressed, ignored, buried so deep it could never surface to cause harm. As though sensing her thoughts, Christopher looked away, focusing on the stream that babbled over smooth stones. "We should return. Lady Marguerite will be waiting to continue your torture." "My education," Rose corrected with a small smile. "Your torture," he repeated, but there was warmth in his voice that had not been there months before. The night of Lady Thornbury's summer ball arrived with oppressive heat. Rose dressed in her new gown of pale green silk, the bodice embroidered with delicate silver thread that caught the candlelight. Her hair had been arranged by a lady's maid skilled in the latest fashions, swept up to reveal the slender column of her neck, with a few carefully placed curls framing her face. When she descended the stairs to where Christopher waited, she saw his expression change, saw something flicker in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. "Like Isabella, yet not like her at all." The journey to London took several hours, and Rose used the time to compose herself, to repeat Lady Marguerite's lessons in her mind, to prepare for the ordeal ahead. When they finally arrived at the Thornbury residence, a grand townhouse ablaze with lights and already filled with guests, Rose felt her courage waver. "Remember," Christopher said as he helped her from the carriage, his hand steady on hers, "you have as much right to be here as anyone, more than most. You are the daughter of a viscount and the sister of a duchess. Let them judge you if they wish. Their opinions matter only as much as you allow them to matter." The ballroom was magnificent, all gilt and crystal with hundreds of candles reflected in enormous mirrors that made the space seem infinite. Music filled the air, and couples already moved through the patterns of a country dance. But as Rose entered on Christopher's arm, the music faltered, and then stopped entirely. Silence fell over the assembly like a heavy blanket, and every face turned toward her. Rose felt the weight of their stares, saw the shock and fascination and hostility in dozens of eyes. She lifted her chin, remembering Lady Marguerite's instruction about posture, about confidence, about never showing fear even when it threatened to overwhelm. Lady Thornbury, a formidable woman in purple silk, approached them with an expression of barely concealed curiosity. "Your Grace," she greeted Christopher. "What an honor to have you attend. And this must be the mysterious Miss Hartley we have all been hearing about." "Indeed," Christopher replied smoothly. "May I present Rose Hartley, sister to my late wife. Miss Hartley, our hostess, Lady Thornbury." Rose executed what she hoped was an appropriate curtsy, not too deep for the wife of a baron, but respectful nonetheless. "Thank you for receiving me, Lady Thornbury. Your home is magnificent." "Ah, how kind of you to say," Lady Thornbury replied, though her eyes were busy cataloguing every detail of Rose's appearance, comparing her no doubt to the Isabella she had known. "You must tell us all about your extraordinary story. It is quite the sensation in town." Before Rose could respond, a sharp voice cut through the murmur of renewed conversation. "Sensation indeed. Some might use a different word. Scandal, perhaps. Or fraud." Rose turned to find Lady Beatrix approaching, Christopher's cousin who had called for her expulsion at the memorial service. She wore black silk despite the summer heat, a pointed reminder that others were still in mourning, even if Rose dared to wear colour. "Lady Beatrix," Christopher said, his voice cooling considerably. "I had hoped we might move past such unpleasantness." "Unpleasantness, you call it? This woman appears claiming to be Isabella's twin, bearing documents that could easily be forged, and you welcome her into your home as though she were truly family. It is unseemly, Christopher. More than that, it is dangerous." Rose felt the eyes of the entire ballroom upon her, waiting to see how she would respond. She could hear Lady Marguerite's voice in her head, counselling restraint, proper deference, the smooth response that would diffuse the situation. Instead, she heard herself say, "You are correct, Lady Beatrix, that my appearance has been unseemly and that my presence causes discomfort. For that I apologize. But I cannot apologize for existing, nor for seeking to understand who my sister was. The documents I carry have been verified by the finest legal minds in Hampshire, examined by clergy and physicians, confirmed by living witnesses. If you choose to believe them fraudulent despite all evidence, that speaks more to your prejudice than to any deception on my part." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. One simply did not speak so directly to one's social betters, particularly not at a formal ball. Lady Beatrix's face flushed with fury. "How dare you?" "She dares because she speaks truth," Christopher interrupted, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "My cousin forgets that Miss Hartley, whatever her upbringing, is the daughter of a viscount and thus of equal rank to herself. She also forgets that Miss Hartley is under my protection, and any insult directed at her is an insult directed at me. I suggest we all remember that." The confrontation hung in the air for a tense moment before Lady Thornbury, ever the skilled hostess, clapped her hands together. "Well, nothing quite livens a ball like a bit of drama, does it? But enough of such serious matters. The musicians are waiting. Your Grace, perhaps you might lead Miss Hartley in the first waltz. I am certain everyone is eager to see her dance." Christopher offered Rose his arm, and she took it gratefully, allowing him to guide her onto the floor. As the music began and they moved into the familiar pattern of the waltz, Rose became aware of something shifting in the room. Some guests were leaving, their disgust at her presence overriding their desire for entertainment. But others were watching with something like approval, whispering behind fans, nodding to one another. "You did not have to defend me," Rose said quietly as they turned. "Yes," Christopher replied, his hand firm at her waist. "I did." And as they danced beneath the chandeliers, watched by all of London society, Rose felt the dangerous truth settle in her heart. She was falling in love with her sister's husband, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. July arrived with scorching heat that seemed to press down on Hampshire like a physical weight. The epidemic that had ravaged the village in late June had finally released its grip, leaving behind empty cradles and freshly turned earth in the churchyard. But it had also left something else, a shift in how the people of Greystone Manor and the surrounding countryside viewed the woman who had appeared so unexpectedly in their midst. Rose stood at the window of her sitting room, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. 4 months had passed since she had first set foot at Greystone Manor, and in that time, everything and nothing had changed. She was no longer confined to the servants' quarters, or treated with open suspicion. The household had accepted her, some grudgingly, others with genuine warmth. Yet the fundamental truth of her situation remained unchanged. She was the sister of a dead woman, living in that woman's home, falling steadily and helplessly in love with that woman's husband. The door opened without warning, and Christopher entered, a newspaper clutched in his hand. His face was drawn tight with barely suppressed fury. "Have you seen this?" he demanded, thrusting the paper toward her. Rose took it, her stomach sinking as she read the headline splashed across the society page. "The Scandalous Intimacy at Greystone Manor. Duke and his sister share more than blood, society whispers." The article was even more vicious than the one that had followed Lady Thornbury's ball. It detailed, with poisonous insinuation, every moment Rose and Christopher had spent working side by side during the epidemic. It transformed acts of mercy into something sordid, suggesting that their long hours together in darkened sick rooms had been devoted to purposes far removed from charitable work. "They are saying we are lovers," Rose said quietly, setting the paper aside. "That I have bewitched you, that you have forsaken Isabella's memory for her scandalous double. It is a lie," Christopher said, his voice hard. Every word of it. Rose looked at him. This man, who had defended her at every turn, who had stood beside her in crisis, who looked at her with an expression that made her heart ache with longing she could never acknowledge. "Is it entirely a lie?" she asked softly. The question hung between them, dangerous and honest. Christopher turned away, his shoulders rigid. "You should not ask that." "Perhaps not," Rose agreed. "But someone must speak plainly. The whispers will not stop, Christopher. They will only grow louder. I have brought nothing but trouble to your house and scandal to your name. Isabella would be ashamed of what I have done to her memory." "Isabella is dead," Christopher said, and there was such rawness in his voice that Rose flinched. "She has been dead for 5 months. I mourned her. I will always carry the grief of losing her and our son, but I cannot spend the rest of my life preserving a shrine to the past, while the present demands my attention." "Ah!" He turned back to face her, and Rose saw something in his eyes that stole her breath. Not the careful distance he had maintained for months, but something closer to desperation. "You asked if the accusations were entirely false," he continued. "The truth is that I do not know any more. I know that I think of you when I wake. I know that the first words I speak each day are often in response to something you said the night before, still echoing in my mind. I know that when you laugh, truly laugh without restraint, something in my chest loosens that has been clenched tight since Isabella died. Is that love? Is it betrayal? Is it simply the confusion of a man who sees his dead wife's face on a living woman and cannot reconcile the difference?" Rose felt tears sting her eyes. "I should leave. I should return to Somerset before this becomes something neither of us can bear." "Yes," Christopher agreed. "You should. That would be the sensible course. The proper course." "But I do not wish to leave," Rose whispered. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and terrifying. Christopher crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just short of touching her. "I cannot ask you to stay," he said, his voice rough. "Not when staying means facing endless scandal and judgment. Not when I cannot promise you anything beyond what we have now. This impossible, tangled connection that defies every rule of propriety and mourning. I do not need promises, Rose replied. I only need to know that I am not alone in this madness, that you feel even a fraction of what I feel when we are together. You are not alone, Christopher said. And finally, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm, solid, real. God help us both. You have never been alone in this. Before either could say more, a sharp knock sounded at the door. They sprang apart as Mrs. Pemberton entered, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes moved from Christopher to Rose with understanding that made Rose's cheeks burn. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but Lord Percival and Lady Beatrix have arrived from London. They are in the drawing room and have requested an urgent audience with you both. Christopher's expression hardened. I specifically instructed that my cousins were not to be admitted without advance notice. They claim the matter cannot wait, Your Grace. Lord Percival used the word intervention. Rose felt dread settle in her stomach. We should go down together, she said quietly. Whatever they have come to say, it concerns us both. The drawing room felt oppressively formal as Rose and Christopher entered to find Lord Percival and Lady Beatrix waiting. Percival stood by the mantelpiece, his thin face set in lines of righteous disapproval. Beatrix sat in the high-backed chair near the window. Her black morning dress, a deliberate rebuke. Cousin, Percival began without preamble, we have come to discuss a matter of grave importance to the family name. This situation with Miss Hartley has gone too far. I was not aware my private affairs were subject to family committee, Christopher replied coldly. Your private affairs ceased to be private the moment they became public scandal, Beatrix snapped. That vile article in today's paper is only the latest in a long series of humiliations. Half of London believes you have taken your dead wife's sister as your mistress. The other half thinks you have lost your mind entirely. Either way, the Whitmore name is being dragged through the mud. The Whitmore name will survive gossip, as it has survived worse, Christopher said. What will not survive is family betrayal. You come into my house uninvited, demand audience, and proceed to insult my guest. I suggest you reconsider your approach. Percival's mouth thinned. Very well. We shall speak plainly. Miss Hartley must leave Greystone Manor. Immediately. We have made arrangements for her to be housed comfortably in a cottage on the estate in Scotland, far from society's scrutiny. She will receive a generous allowance and want for nothing, but she cannot remain here. The association is too damaging to you, to the family, to Isabella's memory. You wish to exile me, Rose said quietly. To hide me away like a shameful secret. We wish to protect the Duke from his own ill-advised compassion, Beatrix replied. You may be Isabella's biological sister, but you are not of our world. You have no understanding of how fragile reputation truly is, how easily a lifetime of respect can be destroyed by a few months of indiscretion. Christopher has sacrificed enough. His wife, his son, his peace. He should not be required to sacrifice his standing in society as well. What if I choose my own sacrifice? Christopher asked, his voice dangerously soft. What if I decide that society's good opinion is less valuable than I once believed? Then you are a fool, Percival stated flatly. And as your cousin, and as a man who has served this family for 40 years, I am obligated to say so to your face. You are not thinking clearly. Grief has clouded your judgment. In 6 months, perhaps a year, you will emerge from this fog and realize what you have thrown away for the sake of a woman who, however unfortunate her circumstances, is fundamentally unsuited to the position she has occupied here. Rose felt something inside her crack at those words, not because they were cruel, but because part of her feared they might be true. She had tried so hard to learn the rules of this world, to smooth the rough edges of her speech and manner, yet she would never be what Isabella had been, refined from birth, comfortable in her role as Duchess, certain of her place in the rigid hierarchy of their world. You are correct, she said, surprising all three of them. Lord Percival is correct. I do not belong here. I have known it from the first day, though I allowed myself to forget in the midst of everything else. She turned to Christopher, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. I will leave, not because your cousins demand it, but because they speak a truth we have both been avoiding. This cannot continue as it is. The scandal will only worsen. Your position, your ability to do good for your tenants and the people who depend on you, all of it will be compromised if I remain. Rose, no, Christopher began. But she held up a hand to stop him. I have a home to return to. People who love me, not because of who I resemble or what blood runs in my veins, but because of who I am. Perhaps it is time I remembered that. She looked at Beatrix and Percival. I will require 3 days to make arrangements and say proper farewells. Then I will depart for Somerset. You need not trouble yourselves with cottages in Scotland. I have no desire to remain dependent on the Whitmore family's charity. Rose, Christopher said again, and this time there was something close to panic in his voice. It is the right decision, she said gently, though it cost her everything to maintain her composure. You know it as well as I do. I should have made it weeks ago before things became so. She could not finish the sentence. Lady Beatrix stood, satisfaction evident in her expression. A wise choice, Miss Hartley. Perhaps you have more sense than we credited you with. After the cousins departed, Rose and Christopher stood in the drawing room, neither speaking, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on them like a physical force. You do not have to do this, Christopher said finally. Yes, Rose replied. I do, not because they are right about everything, but because they are right about enough. I cannot stay here and watch you be destroyed by association with me. And I cannot stay here and continue to fall more deeply in love with a man I can never have. In a life I can never truly live. The admission of love hung in the air between them. The first time either had spoken it aloud. Christopher crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. What if I asked you not to go? What if I said that I would rather face every scandal, every whisper, every condemnation, than lose you now? Then I would remind you that you are still in mourning, Rose said, tears slipping down her cheeks now despite her efforts to contain them. That Isabella deserves better than to be forgotten so quickly. That your son, who never drew breath, deserves to be remembered without the taint of scandal surrounding his father's name. And I would remind you that love, if it is real, sometimes requires sacrifice. Christopher pulled her into his arms then. Propriety be damned. And Rose allowed herself this one moment of weakness. She breathed in the scent of him, felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, memorized the feel of his arms around her. 3 days, he said hoarsely. In 3 days you will leave, and I will let you go, because you have asked it of me. But know this, Rose Hartley. What I feel for you is not confusion or misplaced grief, or the result of seeing Isabella's face on another woman. It is something entirely its own. And it will not fade simply because you return to Somerset. Rose pulled back just enough to look up at him. Then we will both carry this burden, she said softly. And perhaps, in time, it will grow lighter. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. Some burdens only grew heavier with distance. The 3 days Rose had promised passed with agonizing slowness and impossible speed. She spent the hours sorting through what little she had brought with her, packing the simple dresses that now seemed impossibly plain compared to the fine gowns that hung in her wardrobe, gifts from Christopher that she could not bring herself to take. The trunk, Mrs. Hawthorne had left her sat ready by the door, its contents reduced once more to the essential truth of her existence, documents proving she was both more and less than she had believed herself to be. On the second evening, as Rose sat composing a final letter to Margaret and Thomas, explaining her return, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find not a servant but Christopher himself, still dressed in his evening clothes from dinner, his cravat loosened as though he had been pulling at it in frustration. I cannot let you leave without saying what needs to be said, he announced, stepping into the room before she could protest the impropriety. 3 months ago, you asked me what Isabella was truly like. Tonight, I will tell you something I have never told another living soul. Rose closed the door quietly and gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, moving to the window where moonlight painted silver squares on the floor. Isabella and I were well matched on paper, he began, his voice low. She was the daughter of a viscount. I was a duke. Our families approved. Society expected it. But the truth is that I married her knowing I could never love her as she deserved to be loved. There was a woman before Isabella, someone entirely unsuitable, the daughter of my father's steward. We believed ourselves desperately in love, but my father forbade the match. He sent her away with enough money to ensure she would never return, and I, coward that I was, allowed it to happen. I married Isabella 6 months later because it was expected, because I thought duty might cure heartbreak. Rose felt her chest tighten. Did Isabella know? I do not believe so. I tried to be a good husband to her. I was faithful, attentive, respectful. But there was always a part of me I could not give her. A part that remained locked behind walls she could never breach. She sensed it, I think. In her letters, she wrote about feeling she could not reach me. He turned from the window to face Rose directly. When she died, I grieved deeply. Not just for her loss, but for my failure to love her as she had loved me. And I swore that whatever remained of my life would be devoted to preserving her memory, to making amends for that failure. Then I arrived, Rose said quietly. Then you arrived, wearing her face, but possessing none of her gentle acceptance. You challenged me, questioned me, forced me to look beyond the shrine I had built to a woman I had failed, and somewhere in these past months, I have committed the greatest betrayal of all. I have fallen in love with you not despite the fact that you are Isabella's sister, but because you are everything she was not, bold where she was cautious, direct where she was diplomatic, alive in a way that makes me feel alive again. He crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. So I am asking you not to leave, not because I have any right to ask, not because I can offer you an easy path, but because the thought of watching you walk away, of returning to the half-life I was living before you arrived, is unbearable. Rose looked down at him, this proud man kneeling on her floor, offering her everything society would condemn them for taking. Christopher, you are still in mourning. The scandal would be devastating. Mourning can end, he replied fiercely. It has been 5 months. In August, the formal period will be complete. We could wait, keep our distance, maintain propriety for society's sake. But Rose, I need to know that when the mourning ends, you will still be here, that you will consider a future where we might, eventually, stop pretending that what exists between us is merely familial affection or charitable alliance. What you are describing, Rose said carefully, would require me to marry my dead sister's husband, to become the Duchess in her place, to spend the rest of my life being compared to her, being judged as inadequate by those who knew her as I never did. Yes, Christopher agreed. That is exactly what I am asking. And I know it is unconscionable. I know that I have no right to ask you to bear such a burden. But I am asking nonetheless, because the alternative is losing you, and I find I cannot do that. Rose pulled her hands free and stood, needing space to think. She walked to the window and looked out at the gardens Isabella had once tended, the paths she had walked, the rose bushes that bore her name. If I stay, if we pursue this, we must do it correctly. No more whispered meetings, no more moments that can be twisted into scandal. You must complete your mourning period fully. We must conduct ourselves with such propriety that even Lady Beatrix cannot find fault. And when the time comes, when you are free to court openly, then you will court me as you would any other woman. Not in secret, not with apologies, but honestly, before all of society. Christopher joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but careful not to touch. You are asking me to wait 4 more months before I can even begin to acknowledge what I feel. I am asking you to honor Isabella's memory by doing this properly, Rose corrected. She deserves that much, and so do we. If what we feel is real, it will survive patience. And if society refuses to accept it even then. Rose thought of Margaret and Thomas, of the cottage in Somerset, of the life she had lived before learning she was anyone's twin. Then, we will face that when it comes. But I will not have it said that I seduced you in your grief, or that you abandoned your wife's memory for her convenient double. We will give them no ammunition. Christopher was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Very well. You will stay, but we will maintain distance. I will complete my mourning properly. And when August arrives, I will come to you not as a grieving widower seeking solace, but as a man who has chosen his path with clear eyes and asks you to walk it with him. Until August, then, Rose agreed. But even as they made their promises of patience and propriety, Even as Christopher left her room with only the barest brush of his fingers against hers, Rose felt the dangerous truth settling deeper. 4 months might as well have been 4 years. The die was already cast. The following morning, when the household awoke, expecting to find Rose departed, they instead discovered her at breakfast, calmly discussing the week's menus with Mrs. Pemberton, as though nothing had changed. The servants exchanged confused glances, but asked no questions. Christopher appeared shortly after, nodded to Rose with careful formality, and took his seat at the opposite end of the table. If the atmosphere was strained, no one commented. Word reached London within days that Miss Hartley had not left Greystone Manor as expected. The gossip columns erupted with fresh speculation, each theory more dramatic than the last. Lord Percival and Lady Beatrix sent strongly worded letters threatening to petition the church courts for intervention, but Christopher's response was swift and cutting. That night, long after the rest of the household had retired, Christopher sat alone in his study with a single lamp burning low. Another letter from Lord Percival lay open on the desk, its neat, condemning lines blurring as his eyes moved over them. Words like ruin, indecency, and madness leapt from the page, each one an accusation, each one a warning. He thought of Rose upstairs, folding away the modest gowns he had insisted she accept, packing the few belongings she had brought to Greystone, writing what would amount to a farewell to the only parents she had ever known. She was tearing herself out of this new life to preserve the one he had been born into. Coward, a quiet, merciless voice whispered, the same word he had used for himself when he remembered the girl his father had dismissed. He had watched one woman be exiled from his world because he had bowed to duty. He would not stand by and let it happen again. Christopher reached for a fresh sheet of paper, his hand steady as he dipped his pen in ink. If there was a price to be paid for keeping Rose at Greystone, he would be the one to pay it. Rose was his guest, and she would remain so as long as she wished. Any family member who continued to interfere would find themselves unwelcome at Greystone Manor permanently. The letters stopped. The months that followed did not resemble a lover's courtship so much as a long campaign fought side by side. There were depositions to give and accusations to refute, petitions to clergymen and tense meetings with solicitors. Christopher observed the forms of mourning scrupulously, never overstepping the boundaries Rose herself had drawn between them. Yet with every shared battle and each small victory won against those who sought to send her away, something steady and undeniable took root between them. August arrived with golden heat and the scent of ripening wheat. Christopher emerged from formal mourning on the first day of the month, exchanging his black armband for ordinary dress. That evening, after dinner, he asked Rose to walk with him in the gardens. They moved through the roses Isabella had loved, past the fountain where water caught the last rays of sunlight, to a secluded bench beneath an ancient oak. Christopher did not sit, but instead dropped to one knee before her. Rose Eleanor Hartley, he said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he withdrew a small velvet box from his pocket. I come to you not as a man seeking to replace what he has lost, but as a man who has discovered something he never expected to find. You are brave where I am cautious. You are passionate where I am reserved. You challenge me to be better than I am. And I love you not because you wear your sister's face, but because you possess your own extraordinary heart. Will you marry me? Will you become my wife, my duchess, my partner in whatever years remain to us? Rose looked down at him, this man who had defended her against all reason, who had knelt beside her in sick rooms, who had learned to see past the ghost of his first wife to the living woman before him. Yes, she said simply, I will marry you. Not to erase Isabella's memory, but to build something new beside it. Yes, the ring he slipped onto her finger was not the one Isabella had worn. That remained locked away with her other belongings, preserved but no longer displayed. This ring was simpler, a single emerald the colour of Rose's eyes, set in gold. It fit perfectly. They sat together as the sun set, hands joined, neither speaking, both knowing that the hardest battles still lay ahead. Society would not forgive them easily. There would be whispers and cut direct, invitations withdrawn, relationships severed, but they would face it together. As darkness fell, and they finally turned back toward the house, Rose felt Christopher's arms come around her for the first time since that desperate moment in her sitting room months before. She turned in his embrace and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of promises and possibilities, of grief acknowledged and joy cautiously embraced. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I love you," he replied. And in those simple words, spoken under a darkening sky, they both felt the weight of the past begin, finally, to lift. The announcement of their engagement would wait until morning. Tonight, they had earned this moment of peace before the storm inevitably broke over them once more. The announcement of the Duke of Greystone's engagement to Miss Rose Hartley appeared in the Times on a crisp September morning, tucked among notices of other society marriages and business transactions. The wording was deliberately formal, meticulously composed to withstand scrutiny. The Duke of Greystone is pleased to announce his engagement to Miss Rose Eleanor Hartley, daughter of the late Viscount Geoffrey Hartley and sister to his late wife, the Duchess Isabella. The marriage will take place in November at the private chapel of Greystone Manor. By noon, all of London was in an uproar. Rose read the responses as they arrived over the following days, letters both supportive and vitriolic piling up on Christopher's desk. Some came from friends offering cautious congratulations. Others arrived unsigned, filled with accusations that ranged from the absurd to the genuinely cruel. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself sent a terse missive questioning the propriety of a man marrying his deceased wife's sister, citing obscure passages of canon law that might make such a union problematic. "They are invoking the table of kindred and affinity," Christopher explained, tossing the Archbishop's letter onto the growing pile with barely restrained fury. "The same law that forbids a man from marrying his wife's mother or daughter. They argue that a sister falls into similar prohibited degrees." "Does it?" Rose asked, feeling the first stirrings of genuine fear. "Can they actually prevent our marriage?" "The law is ambiguous," Christopher admitted. "It was designed to prevent marriages that might create unseemly family entanglements or disputes over inheritance. But you and Isabella were never raised as sisters. You met only after her death. The spirit of the law does not apply, even if its letter might be stretched to include our situation. But they will try," Rose said quietly. "They will try," he agreed. The first formal challenge came from Lord Percival, who petitioned the ecclesiastical courts to block the marriage on grounds of consanguinity and impropriety. Christopher responded by hiring the most formidable legal minds in London, men who specialized in the arcane intersections of church law and civil statute. They argued that the table of kindred and affinity applied only to blood relations and affinity created through marriage while both parties lived. Since Isabella was deceased, the affinity that might have once existed between Christopher and Rose had been dissolved by death. The courts deliberated for 3 agonizing weeks before ruling in their favor. The marriage could proceed, though the judges made their disapproval abundantly clear in the written opinion. The ruling sparked fresh debates in newspapers and drawing rooms across England, dividing society into passionate camps of support and opposition. "You have become quite the revolutionary," Lady Marguerite observed dryly when she called at Greystone Manor in late September. She had maintained her distance during the height of the scandal, but appeared now with grudging respect. "Whether you intended it or not, you are forcing society to examine assumptions it has held for centuries." "I only wanted to marry the man I love," Rose replied wearily. "I did not intend to become a symbol of anything." "Ah, but that is precisely what you have become," the older woman said. "The woman who defied convention, who transformed from seamstress to duchess through sheer force of will and circumstance. Some call you an opportunist. Others see you as a romantic heroine. A few brave souls even suggest you might be a reformer, though I doubt you sought that role." Rose thought of the anonymous letters, the ones that did not condemn but thanked her. Women who had been denied marriages because of similarly arcane laws. People who had lost loves to rigid interpretations of propriety. They wrote to her as though she had fought their battles simply by insisting on her right to love and be loved. "I never asked for any of this," she said softly. "I only wanted to understand who my sister was." "And in doing so, you discovered who you are," Lady Marguerite replied. "That is no small thing." In early October, Rose received an unexpected summons. The Queen herself wished to meet the woman who had caused such upheaval in proper society. Christopher accompanied her to the private audience, both dressed in their finest, both terrified of what verdict might be delivered. Queen Adelaide received them in a drawing room at Windsor, her expression inscrutable as Rose curtsied deeply and Christopher bowed. The Queen was a woman in her 50s, past the bloom of youth but possessing a dignity that commanded respect. "Rise, Miss Hartley," she commanded. "Let me see the face that has launched 1,000 arguments." Rose stood, meeting the Queen's gaze as steadily as she dared. "You resemble your late sister remarkably," the Queen observed. "I met the Duchess once, at a garden party. She was a lovely creature, gentle and unassuming. You, I think, are rather different." "I grew up differently, Your Majesty," Rose replied. "Circumstances shape us all." "Indeed they do." The Queen gestured for them to sit. "I have read the ecclesiastical court's ruling. I have also read the letters both supporting and condemning your proposed marriage. Do you know why I wish to meet you?" "No, Your Majesty." "Because I wanted to determine for myself whether you are a calculating opportunist or merely a woman caught in extraordinary circumstances." The Queen leaned forward slightly. "I lost my husband 10 years ago. I understand grief, Miss Hartley, and I understand the complicated emotions that follow it. Tell me honestly, do you love the Duke?" Rose felt Christopher's eyes on her but kept her gaze fixed on the Queen. "With all my heart, Your Majesty. Not because he is a duke, not because of anything he can offer me, but because he is a man of principle and compassion who has shown me kindness when the world showed only judgment. I love him in spite of the complications, not because of them. And you, Your Grace." The Queen turned to Christopher. "Do you love this woman, or do you seek merely to preserve an echo of what you have lost?" "I loved Isabella as well as I was able," Christopher replied steadily. "But I love Rose more deeply than I knew was possible. She has awakened parts of me I thought died with my wife and son. I ask no one's permission to honor that love through marriage, only their understanding that what we seek is not scandalous, but profoundly human." The Queen was silent for a long moment. Then she rose, and they hastily followed suit. "I cannot give you my official approval," she said finally. "The Church has ruled in your favor, and I will not contradict that ruling. But neither will I openly endorse a marriage that troubles so many. What I will say is this: you have navigated impossible circumstances with more grace than most would manage. If you choose to marry, do so knowing that you will face continued opposition, but also that history may judge you more kindly than your contemporaries do." It was not the warm blessing Rose had hoped for, but neither was it condemnation. They departed Windsor with the understanding that they would proceed with the Queen's tacit acceptance, if not her enthusiasm. The final challenge came not from church or crown, but from an unexpected source. In late October, just weeks before the planned wedding, a woman arrived at Greystone Manor claiming to be Mrs. Helena Simmons, née Hartley. She insisted she was the legitimate heir to the Hartley estate, and that Rose's documents were fraudulent. "This is absurd," Christopher fumed as he read the woman's petition. "The Hartley line is well documented. There are no surviving relatives beyond distant cousins." But the woman had documents of her own, convincing enough that Christopher's solicitors advised taking the claims seriously. An investigation was launched, and Rose found herself once again defending her very existence, proving through parish records and witness testimony that she was indeed who she claimed to be. The investigation revealed that Mrs. Simmons was a distant Hartley relation who had indeed been named Helena, but she was the daughter of a second cousin and had no legitimate claim to the direct line. More damning, she had been paid a substantial sum by Lord Percival to file her fraudulent claim, a final desperate attempt to prevent the marriage. When the truth emerged, Percival was publicly disgraced. Several of his peers who had supported his opposition quietly withdrew their objections, embarrassed to have been associated with such blatant deception. Christopher cut off all contact with his cousin, ensuring that Percival would never again be welcome at any Whitmore property. "It is finally over," Christopher said as they stood together in the library, the letter confirming Mrs. Simmons's fraud lying on the desk between them. "Every legal challenge has been overcome. Every obstacle has been removed. We are free to marry." Rose leaned against him, exhausted by months of battle. "Are we truly free, or will we spend our entire lives defending this choice?" "Perhaps both," Christopher admitted, "but I would rather spend my life defending our right to be together than spend it regretting the choice to let you go. November will come. We will marry in the chapel where you first appeared like a ghost from another life, and whatever follows, we will face it together." In early November, Rose travelled briefly to Somerset to bring Margaret and Thomas to Greystone Manor for the wedding. She had written to them throughout the ordeal, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of the grand estate, or the magnitude of what their adopted daughter was about to undertake. Margaret wept when she saw Rose in her wedding gown. A creation of ivory silk, far simpler than fashion, dictated but chosen deliberately to avoid any suggestion that Rose sought to replace Isabella in ostentation. "You look beautiful," the older woman whispered, smoothing a wrinkle from the skirt with hands that trembled. "Your mother, your birth mother, would be so proud of you." "I had two mothers," Rose corrected gently. "One who gave me life and one who taught me how to live it. I am proud to be the daughter of both." Thomas, gruff and uncomfortable in his borrowed formal clothes, pulled Rose aside privately. "Are you certain about this girl?" he asked. "It's not too late to come home with us. We'd welcome you back, no questions asked." Rose kissed his weathered cheek. "I love you both with all my heart. But my place is here now, for better or worse. This is the life I must try to build. Then we'll stand witness," he said roughly, "and God help anyone who tries to say otherwise." The day before the wedding, Christopher took Rose to Isabella's grave for the first time since her arrival. They stood together before the simple headstone that marked the resting place of Isabella Catherine Whitmore, beloved wife and mother to a son who had never drawn breath. "I need her blessing," Rose said quietly. "I need to believe she would not hate me for this." "Isabella was incapable of hatred," Christopher replied. "If she could speak, I believe she would tell you that she wished only for my happiness, even if it came through loving another. She was selfless in that way, sometimes painfully so." Rose knelt and placed a bouquet of white roses on the grave, roses from the same bushes Isabella had tended. "I promise," she whispered, "to honor your memory by being the best wife and duchess I can be. I will never try to erase you or pretend you did not exist. You will always be remembered as Christopher's first love, as the gentle soul who brought kindness to this place. And I hope, wherever you are, you can find peace knowing that the man you loved has found happiness again." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying away her words. Whether Isabella heard them or approved, Rose would never know. But as she rose and took Christopher's hand, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her, as though some cosmic balance had finally been achieved. The wedding would take place tomorrow. And whatever trials awaited them beyond that threshold, they would face them as husband and wife, bound not by convention or convenience, but by a love that had survived every attempt to destroy it. The morning of November 15th dawned cold and clear, the sky a flawless blue that seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to occur. Rose woke before dawn, unable to sleep, and sat at her window watching the grounds of Greystone Manor slowly emerge from darkness. In a few hours, she would walk down the aisle of the private chapel and become the Duchess of Greystone, a title that had belonged to her sister, a position she had never imagined occupying. Sarah arrived as the first light touched the eastern horizon, bearing tea and the carefully preserved wedding gown. It was simpler than fashion dictated, ivory silk with minimal embellishment, chosen deliberately to avoid accusations that Rose sought to rival Isabella's memory. Her hair was dressed with flowers from the estate gardens rather than jewels, white roses and sprigs of lavender that Margaret had helped arrange the night before. "You look beautiful, miss," Sarah whispered as she fastened the final button. "Like a bride should look." Happy, and a bit frightened all at once, Rose studied her reflection, seeing not Isabella's ghost, but her own face, older now by experience, if not by years, marked by the journey that had brought her to this impossible moment. "I am both," she admitted, terrified that I will fail him, fail the people who depend on me, fail to be what a duchess should be, but also happier than I have ever been, which seems almost indecent given how much pain this marriage has caused. "Love is never indecent," the maid replied firmly, "and anyone with eyes can see that His Grace loves you true. Not as a replacement for what he lost, but as something entirely new." Downstairs, the chapel had been prepared with simple elegance. White roses, Isabella's favourite, filled the space alongside the lavender that Rose loved. It was a deliberate choice, a blending of past and present, an acknowledgement that both women had shaped Christopher's life and deserved recognition. The guest list was small, deliberately so. Margaret and Thomas Davy sat in the front pew, their weathered faces solemn with emotion. Mrs. Pemberton and the senior household staff occupied the rows behind them. Lady Marguerite had come, offering her presence as tacit approval despite her earlier reservations. A handful of Christopher's closest friends, those who had stood by him through the scandal, filled the remaining seats. Notably absent were Lord Percival, Lady Beatrix, and the majority of London society, who had declared the marriage an abomination. Their absence was expected, even welcomed. This was not a wedding designed to impress the ton, but to unite two people who had found each other against impossible odds. As Rose stood at the chapel entrance, her hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm, she caught sight of Christopher waiting at the altar. He wore formal morning dress, his dark hair carefully arranged, his expression a mixture of anticipation and something deeper, a vulnerability she had come to recognize as his truest self, the man beneath the ducal title, the vicar, an elderly man who had known Christopher since childhood, and who had agreed to perform the ceremony despite vocal opposition from his bishop, began the processional. Rose walked slowly down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Christopher, blocking out everything else, the whispers that would follow this day, the judgment that would shadow their marriage, the impossible standards she would be held to as the second Duchess of Greystone. When she reached the altar, Christopher took her hand, and she felt the tremor in his fingers, the evidence that he too was afraid, that this mattered to him as much as it did to her. The vicar began the ancient words of the marriage ceremony, his voice steady despite the controversy surrounding this union. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honourable estate, instituted of God in the time of man's innocence. Rose listened to the familiar liturgy, words that had joined countless couples before them, words that transformed two separate lives into one shared existence. When the vicar reached the declaration of intent, asking if Christopher would take Rose to be his lawfully wedded wife, Christopher's response was clear and unwavering. I will. And when the question was posed to Rose, she felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment, every sacrifice, every scandal, every sleepless night, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. I will, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small chapel. Christopher slipped the ring onto her finger, not Isabella's ring, which remained locked away with her other possessions, but a new one, a band of gold engraved with roses and lavender intertwined. As he spoke the words, "With this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow," Rose felt tears slip down her cheeks. The vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Christopher leaned down to kiss her, a gentle press of lips that held promise and hope, and the acknowledgement of all they had endured to reach this point. As they turned to face the small congregation, Rose saw Margaret weeping openly, Thomas wiping his eyes with a handkerchief he tried to hide, Mrs. Pemberton smiling with genuine warmth, and Lady Marguerite nodding with what might have been approval or simply acceptance. The wedding breakfast was held in the great dining hall, transformed for the occasion with flowers and candles, the table set for the modest number of guests. Christopher stood and offered the first toast, his voice thick with emotion. "I stand before you today as a man who has been given a second chance," he began, "not to replace what I lost, for that would be impossible and wrong, but to build something new alongside those memories. Rose has shown me that love need not diminish with addition, that honouring the past does not require forsaking the future. She has faced judgment and scandal with courage I can only aspire to match. She has transformed this house from a mausoleum of grief into a home once more. To my wife, the Duchess of Greystone, who has proven herself worthy of that title through character rather than birth." Rose stood as well, surprising several guests who had not expected the bride to speak. "I came to Greystone Manor seeking only to understand who my sister was," she said quietly. "I found instead a family I never knew I needed, a purpose I never imagined I could serve, and a love I never dared hope for. To Christopher, who saw past the face I was born with to the woman I have become. To Margaret and Thomas, who raised me with love when my own family could not. And to Isabella, whose memory I promise to honour not by trying to become her, but by being the best version of myself I can be." The afternoon passed in a pleasant haze of conversation and celebration. As evening approached, the guests began to depart, offering final congratulations and well wishes. Margaret and Thomas were the last to leave, having been given comfortable rooms at the manor for an extended stay. "You'll visit us in Somerset?" Thomas asked gruffly as he embraced Rose. "As often as I can," she promised. "You will always be my parents, no matter what titles I carry. When they were finally alone, Christopher led Rose not to the grand ducal chambers, but to a suite that had been specially prepared. Rooms that held no memory of Isabella, furnished fresh with pieces Rose had chosen herself. It was a deliberate choice, a statement that this marriage would create its own history rather than dwelling in the shadow of what came before. "Are you afraid?" Christopher asked as they stood together near the window, looking out over the darkened grounds. "Terrified," Rose admitted, "but also certain. This is where I belong, Christopher. Not because of blood or obligation, but because I choose it. I choose you." He pulled her close, his arms encircling her waist. "Society will continue to judge us harshly. There will be those who never accept this marriage as legitimate, who will always see you as the opportunist who seduced a grieving widower. Let them think what they will," Rose replied. "We know the truth. That is enough." 5 years passed with surprising swiftness. Rose grew into her role as Duchess with a determination that slowly won over even her harshest critics. She established programs to educate village children, created employment opportunities for women in the textile mills she had inherited through the Hartley estate, and used her own experience of poverty to advocate for reforms that made her both celebrated and controversial. Christopher supported her efforts, finding in their partnership a depth he had never imagined possible. They had 3 children in those 5 years, 2 daughters and a son, each raised to understand that privilege came with responsibility, that their mother's common origins were nothing to be ashamed of, but rather a reminder that worth was not determined by birth. On the anniversary of their 5th year of marriage, Rose visited Isabella's grave as she did every month, bringing fresh flowers and taking a moment of quiet reflection. The headstone had been joined by a smaller one, placed there by Christopher at Rose's request. It marked the grave of Edmund Christopher Whitmore, the son who had never lived but who deserved to be remembered. "I hope I have done you proud," Rose said softly, arranging the white roses with care. "I have loved him well, your Christopher, our Christopher, and I have tried to honor the kindness you brought to this place, even as I have added my own mark to it." A hand settled on her shoulder, and she looked up to find Christopher standing beside her. Their son, 4 years old and full of mischief, held his father's hand. "Mamma, why do you always come here?" the boy asked, innocent curiosity in his eyes. "Because your Aunt Isabella lived here before you were born," Rose explained, drawing him close. "And because it is important to remember those who came before us, to honor them even as we build our own lives." "Was she nice?" the child asked. "Very nice," Christopher replied, his voice steady, though emotion flickered in his eyes. "She would have loved you very much." As they walked back to the manor, their children running ahead on the path, Rose slipped her hand into Christopher's. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The scandal, the battles, the years of judgment." Christopher stopped and turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands. "Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Rose. You taught me that grief does not have to be permanent, that love can exist alongside loss without diminishing either. You have been my partner, my conscience, my greatest challenge, and my greatest comfort. If I could go back and choose differently, knowing everything that would follow, I would make the same choice. Always." Rose leaned into his touch, feeling the truth of his words. Their path had not been easy. Society still whispered, still judged, still questioned the propriety of their union. But they had built something real and lasting. A marriage founded not on convenience or obligation, but on genuine love and mutual respect. As they entered the great house, Rose caught sight of her reflection in the hall mirror. She no longer saw Isabella's ghost, or wondered if she measured up to the memory of the woman who had come before. She saw the Duchess of Greystone, a woman who had started life as a seamstress and had risen through determination, courage, and love to become something she never imagined possible. That night, as Rose prepared for bed, she opened the small wooden box that sat on her dressing table. Inside lay the locket Mrs. Hawthorne had left her all those years ago, containing the miniature portraits of Lady Eleanor and her infant self. She had added another portrait to it, a tiny painting of Isabella commissioned from the artist who had created the original. The 3 faces looked back at her, mother and daughters, separated by circumstances, but united by blood, and by the strange, twisting path that had brought Rose to this place. Christopher found her like that, holding the locket, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "What troubles you?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Nothing troubles me, Rose replied, closing the locket carefully. I was only thinking how strange life is, how one woman's death led to another woman's discovery of herself, how grief and joy can exist in the same space, how the sister I never knew gave me the greatest gift imaginable, not through any action of her own, but simply by existing and leaving a space that needed to be filled. Christopher gathered her into his arms, and they stood together in the quiet darkness, two people who had found each other through impossible circumstances and had chosen again and again to honor that finding despite every obstacle placed in their path. Outside, the November wind whispered through the gardens, carrying with it the scent of roses and lavender, past and present intertwined. Two women whose lives had touched across the barrier of death and given birth to something neither could have imagined, but both, in their own way, would have blessed. This was not the end of their story, but rather the beginning of the life they would build together, a life shaped by love and loss, scandal and redemption, judgment and grace. A life that proved sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with a single trunk of yellowed papers, and a face that reminds us that we are never truly alone, that connection transcends death, and that love, when it is real and fought for, can conquer even the most rigid walls society erects against it. The end.